Good morning, everyone. Welcome to SETA Washington for this conference, U.S. Turkey Relations, 3 years after the July 15 coup attempt. As you know, 3 years ago, Turkey underwent a major upheaval, a major crisis, when there was a coup attempt. And every year we try to sort of put together events addressing the anniversary of the July 15 coup attempt. But as you know, our focus is U.S. Turkey relations, strategic issues that matter to that relationship. And we were lucky enough to put together this conference today. We have great scholars and experts with us. We want to thank them all right at the outset. And today's program is supported by the Directorate of Communications of the Turkish Presidency Office. We would like to thank them as well. So our first panel is on the regional competition and cooperation in the Syrian conflict. We would like to talk about areas of disagreements and agreements between the United States and Turkey, and also how the regional dynamics are playing out and how it might evolve going forward. This morning we have two great distinguished experts with us. Just to my left, Charles Lister is a senior fellow with the Middle East Institute. He's also the director of counterterrorism and extremism program at the Institute. Just to his left, we have Muhittin Ataman. He's the director of foreign policy program at the SETA Foundation in Turkey. I want to welcome them both, and I want to jump into the discussion. And we will start with Charles, who will talk to us about sort of what's happening on the ground, once again, the dynamics, particularly in northern Syria, how it's playing out. As you know, between Turkey and the U.S., there's quite a bit of disagreement that Ambassador James Jeffrey is trying to work on. So I don't want to say a lot before I turn to Charles, so I'll let him sort of give us the lay of the land on the ground. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Yes. Thank you very much for having me. I mean, there's a lot to delve into, and
yes,
there's a lot of details. I'll sort of break up my opening remarks into half. First half, we'll look at, I think, the two defining issues of U.S.-Turkish disagreement, potential for agreement, which is looking at the Northwest and the Northeast as two separate or distinct issues. But then also I want to take a more kind of 40,000-foot approach and look at Syria more broadly as it pertains to U.S., Turkish, and other governments' interests, and how I think the crisis in Syria is set to continue, although in an evolved way. I think that's a subject that I don't think gets enough appreciation these days. So first off, when we're looking in northwestern Syria, clearly this is an area that over the last 2 years or so the US has been squeezed out. It has also decided to be squeezed out. The US ceased support to vetted elements of the Syrian opposition roughly a couple of years ago. That effectively ended our ability to significantly influence events on the ground, and thereby I think handed off a great deal or almost all of the influence to Turkey. It's also an area where the US has significant counterterrorism concerns, but as a result of being sort of squeezed out of that northwestern region, until very recently we have at least understood internally here in Washington that we have no access to the airspace. That's mostly due to Russian measures. I say until recently because the US did just a couple of weeks ago launch the first airstrike in northwestern Syria in roughly 2 years, and targeted an al-Qaeda facility. That was a significant change. Still very unanswered questions as to how exactly that took place. Did it take place with Turkish or Russian permission, or was it a bold American unilateral move? Zip in, zip out, take out a high-level target. We don't quite know yet. Certainly that's been an issue I've pushed hard on the administration here about saying that we do have an interest in keeping a close eye on the Al-Qaeda threat in the northwest of Syria, and in order to do that, we do need access to the air. I assume that has been discussed in the U.S. Turkish negotiations, but certainly none of that has ever been revealed to the public. But more specifically in the northwest, we've obviously seen over the last couple of months significant conflict breakout. The regime, backed by Russia, not in this case by Iran, launched a major ground offensive on opposition-controlled areas in the northwest a couple of months ago, and I think to many people's surprise, have largely failed. In 10 weeks of military operations, the regime has captured about 1% of that opposition zone of territories, incurred very significant losses. Literally just last night, a significant opposition offensive again took more territory from the regime. I think that's been a surprise, and I think a large reason for that isn't just the capability of the opposition and jihadist groups in that region, but also the fact that Turkey has, I think unexpectedly to many here in Washington, taken a very hard stance in pushing back against Russia's backing of the regime's ground offensive through the provision of military equipment, presumably intelligence and other logistical support to Turkey's proxies on the ground. And I find it hard to imagine that hasn't had an effect. Up until now, one of the effects it hasn't had yet is to convince Russia to stop the attack. So I think that tit for tat between Turkey and Russia will probably continue. I think it's been quite humiliating for Russia, the fact that they haven't managed to succeed and achieve more territorial gains. And for me, one of the major points to take away from this is the extent to which the regime continues to have a real manpower problem. It simply doesn't have, without Iranian support and without the support of Iran's dozens of militias who haven't contributed towards this fight, the Syrian regime is incapable of achieving significant territorial gains on the ground against its enemies. And for Russia, that's a big deal. Russia's primary investment in Syria over the last few years has been to try and rebuild the Syrian army as the core of what will be the Syrian state. And in effect, its first test case, without Iranian help, has been in Idlib. And it has been a pretty spectacular failure. And there are pro-regime people who are now acknowledging that in public. So where do we go from that remains to be seen. Very briefly on the northeast, it's very hard to put out too much analysis on this because U.S.-Turkish negotiations seem to be largely frozen about what happens next there. That's one reason. Another reason is because there's a great deal of ambiguity about what the U.S. strategy is now in northeastern Syria, how long we will be around, in what form, with how many allies. There was a story just published a few days ago here that revealed what I had known for a while, which is that the UK and France have agreed to increase their troop presence in northeastern Syria by roughly 10 to 15%. That's relatively negligible because neither of them have more than maybe 250 troops on the ground today. And there's the possibility of a couple Balkan and a couple Baltic states contributing handfuls of troops each. So we might be looking at some point in the future, roughly 600 non-American troops alongside some number of American forces. My assessment is I don't think that's going to be enough for the US to accomplish its stated goals in eastern and northeastern Syria, hence the ambiguity about how long we're going to be around. And I think we all know that Donald Trump isn't particularly excited about staying in Syria. He's been convinced until now to stay in a lesser mode, but I think that lesser mode will convince him again at some point in the future that it's not worth being there. Thus, the emphasis is on these negotiations between the US and Turkey, of which very little is known, and very little seems to have actually been achieved. Briefly, let me do this second part of my comments and look at the 40,000 foot about where Syria is today. I've mentioned, essentially the top line is the crisis in Syria has entered a new phase over the last 6 to 12 months. The lines of control, whether Turkish-influenced areas, US-influenced areas, regime areas with the support of Russia and Iran, those lines are now hardening. They don't actually seem to be moving, like in Idlib. Those lines appear to be hardening because all states, including Turkey, appear to be resolved to hardening those lines and not negotiating them to be changed. I've mentioned Idlib already, I think in some detail. in how it's revealed Assad's continued manpower problem. I don't think that's going to be resolved anytime soon. I think that's also contributing towards the hardening of lines, the division of the country. About 65% is controlled by the regime, roughly 28% is controlled by the US and its partners, and roughly 10 to 12% by Turkey and its partners. Those lines are hardening. What else? I think what's happened in Idlib in particular has, as I say, been quite humiliating for Russia. I think it's been a huge strategic victory for Iran. And the irony is, by doing nothing in Idlib and the northwest, by contributing no ground forces, potentially they've provided some logistical support, but they haven't shed any blood. By doing nothing, the Iranians have proven to Russia, to Damascus, I assume to Turkey, and also to the rest of the international community, just how existentially important Iran is to an Assad victory. Certainly how existentially important it will be to a continued Assad advance. Without Iran, Russia is incapable, unless it sends thousands of its own troops onto the ground, Russia is incapable of guiding the regime towards its own victories. So I think Iran and this whole discussion of Iran leaving, key US demand, has become totally academic as a result of what we've seen in Idlib. There is no way the Russians now have any interest whatsoever in discussing an Iranian withdrawal from Syria, precisely because of this manpower issue. I mentioned also the fact that Turkey's been pushing back against Russia with no real resolution. I think that reveals questions in terms of the viability of Astana or Sochi or any kind of similar process being renewed in a new direction, diplomatic or military. Clearly, the divisions are now emerging between Turkey and Russia when it comes to the situation on the ground. I think clearly Russia and Iran are revealing certain differences in the economic sphere, the political sphere, and the military sphere. So all of this makes the future of Syria look, I think, deeply unstable. The idea that Assad has won in Syria is a myth. What has he won? He has won a crippled country with no capacity to continue to advance against its enemies, with little capacity to control the territory that it regained over the last 18 months. Most of those territories are looking newly unstable now. There are new signs of resistance, new signs of armed insurgencies. Criminality now is being reported by pro-regime sources as worse in regime territories than it was during the height of the war. Warlordism is becoming a consolidated feature of Syrian society. Russian military police have had to deploy in pro-regime areas that have always been controlled by the regime in order to control pro-regime militia commanders who have literally been shelling their own territories in protest at having arrest warrants issued by Damascus. So Russia is having to police its own proxies on the ground. Very briefly, I know I've taken up a lot of time. We haven't even mentioned ISIS yet. I mean, ISIS's territorial caliphate, yes, it's gone, but ISIS remains a very significant threat. In the US area of operations alone, more than 350 attacks have been attributed to ISIS since the fall of the territorial caliphate in the end of March this year. That's a huge number of attacks. In Syrian regime areas west of the Euphrates River, the threat is equally significant. It's minimally, if at all, reported by the regime, but at least 30 to 50 soldiers are being killed every week in the fight against ISIS. But it's important to emphasize that the regime isn't offensively fighting ISIS. They are seeking to contain them, and that has been publicly reported by the regime. They don't have the manpower to go on the offense against ISIS west of the Euphrates, so they have a containment mission. So I think that's going to continue to be a source of instability. Tribes in eastern Syria are increasingly vocally protesting against the SDF and the US. Where does that go? Iran has pivoted to a phase of consolidation now. We've seen a renewed intensity of Israeli airstrikes, including the biggest series of Israeli airstrikes in over a year took place around 10 days ago or so. So that's another source of instability. I've got a variety of other examples, but it goes without saying. The war between the opposition and the regime may be dwindling, but sources of instability in Syria are, I think, actually potentially more powerful than they ever have been. The root causes of the crisis that erupted in 2011 are all still in place. Most of them are even worse now than they were in 2011. And we're not going to see a nationwide uprising like we saw in 2011, but I think it does guarantee that we see nationwide instability, whether it's economic instability, political instability, and to some extent military instability. And I think that's a source of concern for Turkey. I think it's a source of concern for the US. Whether we're in the country or out, it will continue to come back to bite us, and it should be a concern for the rest of the world. But it doesn't seem to be. No one's talking about this. And I think it's important to take that 40,000-foot look at where is Syria post-war. It's not in a good place.
Well, I didn't really assume you were going to end on a positive note, but that was relatively predictable. But I think you raised a lot of very important issues that often, much of the attention has been taken away from Syria, and a lot is going on still, even on a daily basis. Thank you for outlining some of this stuff. Of course, I have some questions I can let you know in advance before turning to Dr. Ataman, but when you mentioned U.S. goals, how it's not going to look like it can be achieved anytime soon, I would like you to elaborate on those goals. What do you base that on, right? Is it Pompeo's statement a while back, or what are the goals, realistic and perhaps more unrealistic ones, and how Trump plays into that? But before I let you answer, let me turn to Professor Ataman for his remarks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for having me here. I want to focus on two different things. The first one is I will also try to mention the facts on the ground. Then the second part of my presentation, I will try to focus on the analysis and some projections. I mean, how it will evolve. We all know that during the early phase of the Syrian crisis, the United States and Turkey had been cooperating. They were supporting mainly the mainstream opposition groups against the Assad regime. They were supporting them financially. They decided to train them, etc. But later on, especially with the emergence, with the rise of Daesh in Iraq, then in Syria, and the control of Daesh, the large part of the Syrian territory, and later on, the rise of YPG as a challenger, one of the challengers against Daesh on the ground, initiated the second phase for both Turkey and the United States. Both countries, the two countries, they began to struggle against terrorism. There was no question there. But the problem is, it was in the definition of the terrorism. I mean, for the United States, it was Daesh, the struggle against Daesh. But for Turkey, it was the struggle against YPG or PYD. When the United States decided to cooperate with YPG in its struggle against Daesh, it made the situation much more complex. Then the two allied countries began to indirectly, through their proxies, to follow different policies on the ground. And unfortunately, this priority hasn't changed yet. I mean, for the United States, still, as Charles just mentioned, still the threat of Daesh, the re-rise of Daesh is still one of the biggest concerns of the United States. So not Daesh and affiliated Al-Qaeda or other radical groups stationed on the Syrian ground. But for Turkey, the rise of YPG is a national security issue. So Turkey prioritizes to fight against Daesh and to get rid of YPG on its borders. Later on, I think nowadays we are in the third phase, that just all sides and with their proxies, they have been trying to consolidate their current positions, with the exception of Turkey. I mean, for now, I think Iran is happy. Still, it's very strong on the ground, in spite of all these heavy sanctions imposed against it. The Assad regime, while it's very weakened, especially after the Iranian section, you know, they barely find even oil for urgent needs. But still, with the support of Iran and with support of with the Russian support, they still able to maintain their position. The United States is quite happy for now. At least it tries to consolidate the position of YPG underground, which controls almost 1/3 of the Syrian territory. I mean, I think for now, it's the most advantageous actor on the ground, compared with the Syrian opposition and the Assad regime, not only due to its control of 1/3 of the territory, but it controls 50% of the arable lands, probably more than 90% of the energy resources, and probably 70% of energy resources and 95% of water potential. That is, they have the strongest position for now. Probably they will make money out of this, you know, by selling oil, natural gas, and other natural resources. So in the near future, it seems that it will be a greater threat against the Turkish national security because of its direct link with the Turkey-based PKK. So when we look at this is one of the most significant facts that we have on the ground, the position, the strong position of YPG. The second one, you know, when we look at on the ground, we see the negotiations between Turkey and the United States continue, but it goes nowhere, unfortunately. For the first time since the start of negotiations, the two countries, they proposed their own papers, demanding their, I mean, for Turkey, it demands a full debt and full control of the proposed security zone, safe zone, on the Syrian side of the border. But the United States proposed a limited debt and with no Turkish control. So this is one of the main disagreements between Turkey and the United States. So we don't know to where it will go after all these negotiations led by Ambassador James Jeffrey and his Turkish counterparts. So the time frame is not agreed, and the future of YPG and PYD remains uncertain. I mean, for Turkey, it's a kind of red line. It's unacceptable to have YPG on its border, but the United States still accepts YPG as the main partner, if not ally, against its struggle against Daesh. Another significant fact is, I have said in the third phase, all sides on the ground, they begin to consolidate their position. So YPG has been strengthening its position. You know, just lastly, 15 different so-called local military councils were established. But all these councils are under the full control of YPG, and YPG has been trying to create some so-called local institutions, and thus it tries to legitimize itself vis-a-vis Turkey and the United States. But we know that whatever will be their names, they are all YPG, and for Turkey, for us, it's plus PKK. So there is no difference between PKK and YPG and it's this so-called local institutions on the ground. You know, just when you look at this, for instance, these military councils, you will see that they are established based upon the YPG and PKK model. All these councils, they have co-chairs, for instance. So they are under the control of YPG. So another fact is we have signed, you know, Turkey and the United States have signed a roadmap, the Manbij roadmap, almost 1 year ago. So according to this roadmap, YPG will leave the western part of the Euphrates, that is the Manbij region. But unfortunately, in spite of all these promises from the US side, nothing has changed. And the Manbij roadmap stopped progressing. So YPG hasn't left the region on the ground. So the only thing has changed there. The United States and Turkey, you know, they have been patrolling the region independently and jointly. So this is the only change in the Manbij region. Another thing is, you know, we have all watched that the US President Donald Trump promised the withdrawal of the US troops from the northeastern part of Syria, but for now, the US side doesn't speak at all about the withdrawal. So on the contrary, the United States asked France and the United Kingdom and even Germany to contribute to their troops. I think, you know, as it's written in the international media, France and the United Kingdom agreed to increase the number of their troops by 10 to 15%. It seems that Germany has declined this offer, so they will follow a wait-and-see policy in this case. Another fact is Pentagon has requested an additional 30 million budget to support their partners, their partner forces in Syria. And the budget will include arms and equipment supplies and training for troops. So it seems that Pentagon and CENTCOM, they will continue to cooperate and support YPG. The last point of the facts will be resentments within the Turkish society against the Syrian refugees has increased, especially before and after the local elections in Turkey. Mainly it's the opposition political parties. They have been increasingly problematize the existence of the Syrian refugees in Turkey. And unfortunately, recently there were some even attacks in Istanbul and in some other Turkish cities. So the existence of 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey will be a kind of further a political fault line between Turkish political parties. And for now, it's the AK Party government, the main actor, keeps away, that is the hatred towards these Syrian refugees. But with the weakening of the ruling party, and the rise of the power of the political opposition in Turkey, the stronger they are, the weaker the position of the Syrian refugees will be. So it will be a political fault line. When we look at the analysis and projection side, we see that unfortunately the Turkish-US negotiations are taking too much time, and it goes without any real progress, unfortunately. It seems that recently the White House left the ground to the Pentagon and especially to CENTCOM to be the leading actor on the ground for the United States. So the position of the Trump administration and its special envoy, Ambassador James Jeffrey, it seems it has weakened compared with the previous months. So that's why the U.S. withdrawal decision and the negotiations of a safe zone came only after the Turkish elections, that is, with the Turkish initiatives, unfortunately. Turkey made the announcement that is to launch a military operation, a unilateral military operation in Syria only after the explanation made by CENTCOM to establish observation points along the border. So it seems that the more CENTCOM takes initiatives in the Syrian conflict, the more Turkey will take unilateral actions against YPG. That is, it becomes much more difficult for the two sides to cooperate and to agree on the future of YPG and the region. So due to the lack of the progress in the negotiations and especially in the Manbij roadmap, while YPG is further entrenching itself in the east of the Euphrates, Turkey, in this context, thanks to the U.S. supplies for sure, a Turkish unilateral operation against YPG may become inevitable. That is, Turkey does not want such a move for now, but it seems that the U.S. side pushes or forces Turkey to take such an action, unfortunately. You know, because the United States and other Turkish allies, they are unfortunately largely remain indifferent to Turkey's national security concerns. And for sure, as I have said earlier, Turkey considers this as a red line in terms of protecting its national interest, in securing its border, and to ease the tension emanating from the Syrian refugees inside of Turkey. Therefore, Turkey's motivation to establish a safe zone in the east part of Euphrates has increased. And Turkey is expecting to return at least some of these refugees. It's expected that over 1 million refugees may return to the proposed safe zone if it's established, for sure. So for Turkey, it's also an economic crisis, a political crisis, and a military crisis. So the refugee problem began to gain some other dimensions. Until very recently, it didn't have a security one, for instance. So general trends in the U.S.-Turkish relations, such as S-400 and F-35 issues, may also influence the positions of the two states regarding the region. So I haven't mentioned much about Idlib side, that is the western part of the border. We know that when it comes to Idlib region, the two states, they come together mostly. But at the end, all actors on the ground, including Turkey, they have too much dilemmas. That is, when they decide to take some actions, the alternative costs seem too high. So they are unable to do what they think. So this is the case also for the United States, for Russians, for Iranians, for other regional actors. Maybe in the second round, I may concentrate on these issues. Yeah, this is it for now.
All right, thank you. Again, maybe I'll let you take it. I'll give you a preview of the questions I want to ask you. If you could look at the Turkey's if you look at Turkey's military actions in northern Syria, we see that major operations were conducted after July 15th coup attempt 3 years ago. That's kind of the occasion today. Maybe you could talk about how the evolution of that Turkish military's approach to northern Syria happened over the past 3 years, and how that has had an effect on the U.S. Turkey relationship. Charles, as I mentioned, maybe you could talk about those U.S. goals and also address a couple of the things maybe Professor mentioned about, U.S. withdrawal, U.S. priorities in terms of it being an ISIS fight, as opposed to Turkey seeing it much more in terms of, an anti-PKK fight.
Right. Yeah. Well, so yeah, let me start off on
Sure.
just a few sort of replies. I mean, I think that's a very apt description. Without a doubt, the U.S. Over the last several years has focused obsessively on the fight against ISIS above and beyond anything else that's happened in Syria. And very clearly, as a consequence of the way that strategy has been built, Turkey has, I think, similarly focused obsessively on the fight against PKK above and beyond any other issues in Syria. Both countries would say we're doing that for our own national security interests. But the sort of horrible irony of that is that by pursuing those national security interests, our differences have only got bigger and bigger, and a solution to those differences has become further and further away. I think on the whole withdrawal issue, we're dealing with a very unique administration here in Washington. It's disjointed. The White House doesn't work in close tandem with the State Department and with CENTCOM and with the DoD and with the intelligence community. And in many respects, people have always complained that separate arms of the US government pursued their own policies, but it's never been more extreme than it is today. And I think when one listened to President Trump saying that we're going to withdraw from Syria in December, lo and behold, 3 or 4 weeks later, he had been convinced to change his mind. Now, those of us who think that the US does have an interest in staying in Syria, and that does include me, remain concerned at the fact that clearly Donald Trump's gut tells him, get the hell out of Syria. I mean, he called Syria nothing but death and sand, and I genuinely think he believes that. For now, he's been convinced to have a different policy. Whether or not we've seen, as you've described it, the White House giving CENTCOM and the DoD more authority to do its own thing, I don't think that's necessarily the right way to view it. I think more realistically, the White House just isn't doing a lot on Syria. And so therefore, as a result, CENTCOM and the DoD do their own thing. The State Department is doing its own thing. And there's very little that ties it together. That's one of the reasons why most of the world is complaining about a total lack of clarity from the US in terms of its Syria strategy, is because there is no glue tying all of these various strands together. USAID does its thing, State does its thing, DoD does its thing, SOCOM does its own thing, and then the White House is somewhere up here, and every now and then the White House chooses to get involved in one of those pockets, but more often than not, it's not, unless it comes to the Iranian issue, which is the White House's obsession these days. But to go towards your question about U.S. goals and achievements, actually, sorry, let me just rewind. That's also the reason why Jim Jeffrey and people underneath him have been so silent. Is, to speak frankly, and I know them all well, including Jim, who I have a great deal of respect for. The reason why they've been so silent is if they come out in the public in front of the world's media and say, we're not withdrawing anymore, we are staying, we have this plan, and this plan, we're spending this much money, and we're going to stabilize, and we're going to be here for 5 years, guess what's going to happen? Donald Trump's going to go on Twitter and say, hell no, we're not doing that, we're leaving Syria, we're withdrawing, the hammer's down on the table. That's why we've seen the silence. Now, it works for Jim, Jeffrey, and others, because they're able to do what they're doing quietly and under the surface and away from the president's attention. But ultimately, there's still the fear that at some point the president will wake up, hear something on the news about what we're doing, and say, right, this is ending now. So hence the ambiguity. But what are our goals? I would say our goals or our objectives are on two levels. The top line goals have been repeatedly stated. Really, there's three of them. The first one is an enduring defeat of ISIS. In other words, it's more than a territorial defeat, but we have to ensure that that defeat becomes enduring. They don't resurge, they don't come back, they don't continue to pose a local or an international threat from Syria and Iraq. The other component is an Assad component. It is no longer seeking the removal of Assad. Now we're seeking a behavioral change in the regime, which has been at different times defined in different ways by different administration officials. But more than less, we're looking for a cessation of their relationship with Iran. We're looking for an end to their support for terrorist organizations, whether the likes of Hezbollah and Shia militias or Al-Qaeda and Daesh. We are looking for an interest in reintegration into the international system along international norms. We're looking at the idea of an actual political process happening, which the regime seriously engages with rather than blocks, which is all they've done over the last 8 years. And we're looking for a future UN-run elections. And then the third is Iran. That's the big one for this administration, a complete removal of all Iranian forces and their non-Syrian allies from Syrian territory. Now, quite frankly, with the means that we have on the ground in Syria, with the leadership that we have in the White House, and all of the implications that brings, we're not going to achieve any of those three objectives. An enduring defeat of ISIS is impossible while most of the world think we are about to imminently leave and the president doesn't want us to be there, when our own allies on the ground are increasingly questioning how long we're going to be around and are talking to others, including Damascus, about other options. Turkey is, I think, to put it frankly, ready to pounce on any sign of US weakness in Syria. So ISIS, for ISIS, who are weaker than they have been for a number of years, that is a perfect scenario. Confusion about the US, an inevitable, as you say, a potentially inevitable Turkish intervention, a weak regime, a stumbling Russia, a consolidating Iran. All of that is a dream scenario for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I think the regime is going to continue to block any political process. We keep hearing the signs that this constitutional commission, which the UN has been negotiating, is going to be formed. In fact, just a few days ago, there were reports saying there's finally agreement on the final 6 names. It's been agreed, and then the UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen went to Damascus and said, we've still got to negotiate a little bit further. In other words, the regime said no. So the regime, I think, is going to continue to block a political process, which means the Assad objective of seeing a behavioral change isn't going to happen. And Iran is a fantasy. Iran is never going to leave Syria. What they have accomplished and established and built in Syria is the final strain in their regional dream since 1979, which is to tie Tehran to the Mediterranean. They finally achieved that. Why on earth would they give it up for the sake of a political agreement in Damascus, which would in effect change very little? Assad would still stay. So I'm concerned mostly because of the ambiguity that this administration presents, and because it's done very little other than weaken our hand in Syria by ceasing all support for the opposition, by pulling stabilization support from most of northern Syria, by presenting a very confusing picture on the diplomatic stage, by continuing to push on this Iran thing over and over and over again, even though we all know it's going to be a fantasy. That means that, yes, we have a clear set of objectives, but it doesn't mean we're going to achieve any of them, frankly.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Another negative conclusion.
Well, I wouldn't expect any worse thing. The bad picture you depicted. Professor, you touched upon the CENTCOM, what they do, and then it seems that from what you said, Turkey's calibration about military force, use of military force in northern Syria has a lot to do with the U.S. actions, U.S. military's actions on the ground. And as I mentioned earlier, Turkey's posture has changed significantly since the July 15 coup attempt. So maybe you can address those.
Okay, sure. You have correctly mentioned that there is a kind of rethinking in Turkish security strategies after July 16. We know that it was an interesting attempt. That is, it was not a typical coup attempt. It was, as we call it in Turkey, it was executed by a parallel structure, as we call it in Turkey. That is, a group kind of occupied the half of security institutions in Turkey, including the armed forces, the police forces, the Turkish intelligence, etc. So there was a kind of disagreement between the political authority and the security forces. After this coup attempt, we know that almost half of Turkish high-level security officers, they were expelled. Most of them, they are imprisoned because of their involvement in the coup attempt. So for now, unlike the United States, in Turkey, there is a kind of complete tandem between the political authority and other state institutions. So the first change is the change of mentality, the political discourse of the security forces. The second significant change was, and as a result of this, many people began to discuss, by the way, the vulnerability, the weakening of the Turkish security forces, etc. So Turkey, I think, had to show the region and to its adversaries and friends that it is still one of the strongest military power in the region, and that therefore, only 1 month after the coup attempt in August 2016, Turkey initiated the military operation, which is called Euphrates Shield operation against ISIS. By the way, Turkey, unlike the United States, I think there is a difference as a parenthesis between Turkey and the United States. Turkey has been trying to convince its allies to launch a kind of all-inclusive struggle against all terrorist groups, including YPG, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whoever they are on the ground. But when it comes to the United States, the problem is the United States doesn't recognize some groups as terrorist organizations. So the first military operation was exclusively against Daesh, against ISIS on the ground. It got rid of Daesh on its border in 2016 and 17. Then the second military operation was executed against YPG this time in the western part of the border in Afrin province against YPG this time, but it was shorter, it was less costly since they have just left the region and transferred their powers to other YPG control areas, especially to Tel Rifat region, which was also part of the Afrin. So when we look at the Turkish position, yes, one of the changes, and still another change in Turkish security strategy was to face the threats not inside of the Turkish territory, but outside of, that's beyond the border. As a result of this, Turkey intensified its military operations not only in northern Syria, but in northern Iraq as well. Even nowadays, the Turkish security forces have been bombing the Kandil mountain, and they just killed one of the executive officers, that's one of the top officials of PKK in Kandil mountains. So this is one of the, I think, significant changes in Turkish security mindset to face the threats beyond the borders. And as a result of, or as a continuation of this, you may see also the Turkish kind of semi-military operations or showing power in the Eastern Mediterranean region, sending drill ships to the region or the ships to make research, academic research or seismic research there. And with the increase of its defense industry, its military capabilities and capacity, Turkey, I think, is able to execute more unilateral operation compared with a Turkey, let's say, a decade ago. So there are too many changes going on inside of Turkey, and all this has significant implications on its foreign operations.
Thank you, Muhittin Hocam. I'd like to open it to questions. If we have questions from the audience, before I ask too many questions and we run out of time. Any questions from the audience? Sure.
Sorry.
Hold on. Wait for the microphone, please.
Okay, well, can you define again what's YPG stand for?
Take that one on.
Okay. YPG, we have different definitions of YPG. That is on the Turkish side and on the U.S. side. Officially, not in reality. Officially, Turkey considers YPG as an offshoot of PKK, terrorist organization, which is considered as a terrorist organization both in Turkey and in the European countries.
And in the U.S.
In the United States. So the United States, when it comes to the United States and the EU countries, that is other NATO members, they consider YPG as somehow related to PKK, but not as a direct offshoot of PKK. So they don't consider this as a terrorist organization. But unfortunately, we see that they have the same political discourse. They have the same leadership. That is KCK. This is the name of the highest authority of all these organizations, all offshore organizations based in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. They are under this authority based in Kandil Mountains in the north of Iraq. So, for instance, all YPG offices, they hang the portrait of Abdullah Öcalan, which is the founder and the leader of PKK, who is imprisoned now in Turkey. They hang his pictures, his portraits, in all YPG and PYD institutions. That is, officially they consider him as the leader of YPG. So there is, unfortunately, a kind of, I don't know how to put it. So there is a difference between Turkey and the United States.
On the definition.
Yeah, on the official grounds. Yes. In reality, most people in the United States, they know what I have just said. They accept this, but officially they still claim that it's not a terrorist organization. In order to be able to cooperate and support it, for sure.
I think using the word officially is the most apt way of describing it. I mean, officially, the U.S. government will not acknowledge that the YPG is the Syrian affiliate of the PKK. The State Department, until 2014, when we started working with the YPG, had on its own State Department website, as did the CIA World Factbook, that the PYD, which is the political wing of the YPG, was the Syrian affiliate of the PKK. In sort of private conversations with serving US officials, some of them will say, yes, we decided to team up with a terrorist organization to fight another terrorist organization. That was a pragmatic decision that we made based on the fact that the PKK doesn't threaten US domestic security and ISIS does. I think that's the most simple way you will hear it. Sometimes you'll hear people like Ambassador Jim Jeffrey say, it was a, what's the word? It was like a transactional relationship. It's not a strategic relationship. It's not something in which we're going to create a new state and prop that up and provide it with with 100 years of international support. It was a transactional relationship. The YPG wanted to fight ISIS, so did we. They were in the right place. We needed them at that time, so we created that relationship. How long that transactional relationship continues is the biggest question mark in everyone's mind. I assume not least in Ankara.
And one addition to this, by the way, Turkey has offered to contribute its ground forces to the U.S. struggle against ISIS, especially during the Raqqa operation. At the beginning, Turkey was unable to struggle. Turkey has been struggling on many fronts with terrorist organizations. We have too many terrorist organizations inside of Turkey. We have PKK inside and outside of Turkey. We have ISIS inside of Turkey and outside of Turkey. One of the most harmed countries by ISIS operations is still Turkey. I mean, they have killed hundreds of people inside of Turkey with dozens of their attacks in the country. So Turkey has asked the United States to contribute to its struggle against Daesh, against ISIS in Raqqa. But unfortunately, in those days, it was declined. So they continue to cooperate to work with the YPG and PYD.
Sure. One here, one back there.
Just a comment which I don't think you made. As I understand it, feel free to disabuse me of it. YPG has been one of the most effective opposition groups in fighting Daesh in Syria. Is that not true?
Charles?
Happy to reply first. They've certainly been effective. I think over the last 4.5, 5 years, they've obviously captured 28% of Syria from ISIS, from Daesh, with a very significant amount of US support, especially air support. Many people in this city, until the intervention in Afrin, said US air support's important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. The YPG is still an extraordinarily effective military player. But without US air support, they completely collapsed in Afrin, way faster than anyone, including this city's biggest YPG supporters, ever expected in the analyst community. They completely collapsed. So yes, they've certainly done their part, and they've paid a huge price for doing it. And as an American, and as a Brit, I still commend them for fighting Daesh. I do still think, though, that the US strategy of partnering only with the YPG has had very detrimental impact, of which I think we're only really now seeing. The other element here is that there are others in Syria who have also fought Daesh. Back in January 2014, so roughly 6 months before ISIS exploded onto our news screens, the Syrian opposition, which at the time both we and Turkey were supporting, defeated Daesh in 4.5 Syrian provinces in 12 weeks, which is, in very simplistic terms, by a million miles the most effective counter-ISIS campaign we've seen in Syria throughout the whole war, because of the sheer scale and speed of that offensive. So that's often forgotten as context. The opposition will always say we were the first that were to fight ISIS because they were in our midst right from the beginning. ISIS said that they were going to team up with the opposition, and very soon they turned on them. So the reality is somewhat more complicated. But certainly the YPG have played a very significant role. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
For my part, to me, the only difference between YPG and other Syrian opposition groups was they are a much more concentrated and disciplined group. And on the other side, the Syrian opposition groups, they are too divided. They were too divided, and they are still divided. So Turkey, at the beginning, Turkey offered the United States to provide this amount of support to certain Syrian opposition groups to fight against Daesh. Since the beginning, we know that the first target of ISIS was the Syrian opposition groups. the ISIS-controlled group at its zenith, almost 85% of the territory they got from the opposition groups. So they were the main target of ISIS, and they were quite ready to fight against them. And they are still fighting. They are not the same. But unfortunately, on the other hand, as just Charles mentioned, to me, the opposition groups, they were much more dedicated to fight against Daesh and against the regime. But unfortunately, it went the other way. That is, the United States provided air support to them, supported financially and especially in military equipment and arms, weapon systems.
Just one sentence, maybe Turkey also sees that as an investment by the umbrella organization for a political goal, not for the sake of fighting ISIS only on the part of YPG. So that's another sort of disagreement.
Try to legitimize their position.
In the back, I saw a hand there. Yes.
Hi there. I'm just trying to better understand the argument you made in reference to a changing Turkish mindset, one that's characterized by a more assertive military presence in the region, Turkish military presence in the region. And I think you said there's possibly two reasons for that. One is following the coup attempt, there was a feeling that the Turkish military had to prove that it was still a capable, strong military force. And post-coup, post-purge of officers who were involved in the coup, that it was now more consolidated under government control. Is that the argument you were trying to make?
Muhittin Hocam.
Yeah. After the coup attempt, some observers began to discuss the vulnerability of Turkey. And, so it was a kind of to show the region that they are still intact and they are still there. They are still a regional power. Second, there are too many projects going on in the region, unfortunately. So Turkey considers most of these projects against its national interests. So military existence or this transnational military operations is directed to these possible projections, that is, to prevent the success of these projects, one of which is the establishment of a YPG state in the northern part of Syria. So Turkey has been trying to play a kind of game changer role in the region. And unfortunately, left by its NATO allies, left by Russia, there are some cooperations on the ground between Turkey and Russia, but we know that they are supporting conflicting sides. As just Charles mentioned, they are still the main supporter of the Assad regime. We are not easy with Iran. They are still the main supporters of the Assad regime. Unfortunately, recently we don't have friendly relations with the Gulf states, including Israel, recently increasingly with Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Turkey is kind of encircled by too many crises and future projections. Therefore, it has to take unilateral initiatives, and that's in order to protect its national interest and security concerns.
Well, in the question, there was a distinction about, do you feel that Turkish military and the political sort of establishment, is it more consolidated?
For now, there is more consolidation compared with the previous areas. Turkish military was mostly hesitant to intervene in the Syrian crisis. The perception was Turkey was on the ground in the Syrian conflict, but Turkey was not. Mm-hmm. Turkey just entered.
Also, the U.S. was at the time saying, Obama made that criticism that Turkey was not using its forces against Daesh in Syria.
Exactly.
And that was the context as well.
That was the context before the coup attempt, and after the coup, Turkey has just met this criticism and intervened. We know that especially on the border, on the Turkish-Syrian border, 90% of high-level military officers were imprisoned. That is, they were FETÖ members. So they were hesitant to intervene in the crisis, unfortunately.
One more here.
Yeah, in this country, when an ally starts getting too close to Russia, other than the president himself, it causes some concerns, especially with the NATO people. Can you talk more about the S-400 and F-35 deals and what that says about the Turkish-Russian relationship?
Okay, so
You opened that Pandora's box. So.
okay, yeah, this is probably this issue will be discussed in the afternoon session because it's specifically focused on the Turkish-U.S. relations. But I can shortly explain that, Turkey was a kind of force to the Russian side. As I've said, in the Syrian crisis, for instance, in 2015, when Russia intervened, the Syrian crisis, Turkey was one of the most unhappy actors in the region because the Assad regime was about to fall in those days. Many observers following the Syrian conflict, they were claiming that the days of the Assad regime was limited, counted. But when they intervened, they just prevented the collapse of the regime. Later on, one of the fighter jets of Russia was shot down by Turkey, etc. There are too many things going on. And suddenly, the relations between Russia and Turkey downgraded to zero. Yeah. So on even all tourists, economic activities, etc., all stopped. Later on, for the Turkish side, it was a kind of obligatory position, when the United States was fully supporting YPG in Syria, when the United States declined the sale of Patriot air defense system to Turkey. So Turkey decided to, first of all, just to your question, decided to provide this system in order to be able to protect its territory. Turkey Turkey signed an agreement with China to provide this air defense system. After the heavy pressure from its Western allies, Turkey withdrew its signature. Later on, it decided, again, the U.S. side declined the Turkish offer to buy Patriot missiles. Then it turned its face to Russia this time. So Russia promised two things. One is to sell S-400 Patriot missiles, and second, to transfer related technology to Turkey. That's one day Turkey will be able to produce its own defense systems by itself. And this time, then, the United States, to me, exaggerated this deal, as just explained by President Trump in Japan in G20 summit. He declared that it was an unjust move on of the Obama administration, because Turkey was ready to pay and to buy Patriot missiles, but it was declined. The offer was declined. So it's a kind of complex issue to us, to Turkey, and it's unrelated with F-400. So it's the U.S. side which relate these two issues and take it together. And in the afternoon, probably we'll hear more detailed discussion on this.
All right. Thank you. One more here. Microphone, please. Just 1 second. Thank you. Right there.
You raised the issue of Iran earlier. If there is some type of military engagement between the United States and maybe its allies with Iran, what do you see kind of as the ramifications in Syria and to some degree in Turkey?
It's a scary proposition because I think any kind of real conflict with Iran will be hugely damaging for us, for Iran, and for the region. For Syria, I mean, I would find it hard to believe that if that worst case scenario did kick off uncontrollably, I think Iran's positions in Syria would fast become a serious vulnerability. I think some within the Trump administration would be very keen on taking advantage of a conflict with Iran to go after Iran in Iran, but that does come with serious risks. I imagine the Israelis would be saying, you know, look what we've done over the last several years with very little cost. Let's remove what I called earlier, you know, the jewel in the crown of Iran's regional strategy. I would find it hard to imagine that Syria wouldn't become involved. Not Syria as a government, but Syria as a territory. Just simply because of how strategically important it is for the Iranians, and also how strategically vulnerable it is. The big question, of course, would be whether or not Russia's S-400 systems in Syria would seek to protect Iran in that scenario or not. I would find it very hard to imagine the Russians would risk war with America in order to protect an Iranian position in Syria, which, quite frankly speaking, the Russians could do without. The Iranian issue for Russia right now is the biggest stumbling block for what Russia ultimately wants, which is a political deal that the United States signs. And Iran is always going to be the thing that blocks that. So, worst case scenario, if conflict started, the Russians might step back and watch for a little while, and then Vladimir Putin would have an opportunity to look like a peacemaker and say, right, enough's enough, now's the time to negotiate. But I seriously hope that doesn't come to pass. There was a very serious effort recently undertaken to assess what an Iranian-US regional war would look like, and it would have resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths. So let's hope it doesn't happen.
In fact, you mentioned the goal being elusive and it's never going to happen. Iran will never, obviously by its own volition, leave Syria. Just to confirm, you don't see a serious U.S. investment underway to make that happen anyway, right?
No, I mean, the Trump administration talks a really good Iran game, but the only thing they've done is sanctions. And sanctions have an effect, but they're not going to convince Iran to leave Syria. If the Trump administration considered something else, it would lead to this scenario, which nobody wants, particularly the president, which some reporting has revealed, but I certainly know for sure. The president never wanted to hit back at the Iranians in the Gulf a few weeks ago. He was never in support of it. We weren't as close to hitting them either. There was never a green light given. So the idea that we were 10 minutes away from hitting Iran is a myth that was very purposefully concocted in the White House in order to deter Iran from further acts of aggression. I mean, there was a strategy behind it, but Donald Trump was no way near close to authorizing military action against Iran. So I do think that's an important context to bear in mind. This isn't, when it comes to Donald Trump making the decisions, this isn't a hawkish presidency. He does not want war with anybody. Quite clearly, he sees himself as having been voted to avoid war, avoid interventions, avoid spending money abroad. The last thing he wants to do is authorize something that will create a huge regional conflagration in which we're the main player.
Okay. So if there are no more questions, I want to just give the last word to both of you, actually, if you have concluding remarks, and then we'll close the session.
Maybe I'll go first because I actually have a question for you, so which I thought might lend to the discussion. But I mean, to close, I mean, I think it goes without saying that my opening remarks, I think, made clear that Syria is going to be mired in instability for a long time to come. I don't see Turkey withdrawing from the Euphrates Shield or Afrin areas anytime soon. So clearly, Turkey's going to have challenges coming its way just from those territories. You know, this morning there was a big truck bomb in Afrin, killed 13 civilians. Those kind of incidents are certainly going to continue. If there's an ISIS resurgence, I'm sure that will also see Turkey and its Syrian proxies as a target. Likewise, if the US continues to stay in Syria in a diminished presence, or with a diminished presence, we will also look increasingly vulnerable. And then Assad hasn't won Syria, he has survived. And he has won a totally crippled country with a negligible economy, with no capacity to reconstruct. In fact, the reconstruction issue is a really interesting one. I mean, the World Bank did a number of calculations about this. They said, imagine an ideal scenario in which there's no corruption, there's no government incompetence, they know what they're doing, they're able to coordinate and plan effectively. Even then, just to rebuild the residential sector of Syria, and nearly 2.5 million homes have been destroyed over the war, just to do that would take 15 years of massive work, but it's totally impossible because Syria only has the capacity to produce 5% of the cement that they would need to undertake that 15-year mission, and 0% of the capacity to produce the amount of steel and iron they would need. And even if they had the money, which they certainly don't, to import it, they don't have the ports or the roads that would be capable of importing it into Syria. So, and residential areas is just one small pocket of the reconstruction challenge. And I think, using anecdotes like that tells you a lot about how bad the situation really is in Syria and how unlikely we are to see it stabilize and become peaceful in the future. And that just takes me to my one question, which I was interested in this discussion about Syria and in the U.S. Turkey relations, negotiations. A big issue on a lot of people's minds here in Washington has been whether or not Turkey would ever reconsider a ceasefire with the PKK, as Erdogan did unilaterally a number of years back, as a way of assisting the negotiations over northeastern Syria, with us, with the SDF, with the YPG. And a lot of people's minds were piqued a few weeks ago here in D.C. when Abdullah Öcalan was suddenly allowed access to his lawyers again for the first time in several years. So my question is, is that a one-off? Is this just a kind of like a random development in Turkey, but with nothing strategic behind it? Or is there space for an opening up of negotiations? Because Öcalan's recent letters through his lawyers have called for negotiations and not conflict, which is interesting. It's a challenge for Turkey. He's taking the peaceful line and challenging you to do the same. I would just be interested in, having come from Ankara, what is the thinking on this?
It was totally random.
Okay, there we go.
As a concluding remarks, I want to mention 2 points. I share almost everything what Charles has just said. To me, Syria will remain divided. For now, it seems it will be 3 parts. That is YPG-controlled area, the regime area, and the opposition area, under the control of Turkey. That is a Turkish, American, and Russian, plus Iranian proxy actors on the ground. The second thing is, unlike Iraq, which has too much resources, reconstruction in Syria will be very, very difficult. I agree with you. So the worst part is, I have just said, most natural resources are on the YPG-controlled area. So it's strategically, it's the most, it's the strongest actor on the ground. So the Syrian part, the regime part, it's a desert-like territory. It has very little resources over there. So it has too much disadvantages. When it comes to your question, yeah, there is some rumors in Turkey. Let me just, not to extend the topic, just several points. The first one is there is kind of division between the Kandil Mountains and the Abdullah Öcalan and his close circle. This was a long time difference, but recently it increased. this difference has increased. Second point, Turkey, if it begin to renegotiate, probably it will not be similar to the previous one. Because the previous one was too much open. You know, the state side left a large room for maneuvering for the PKK, for its associates, etc. But for now, Turkey will not stop its struggle against terrorism, which at the end, nowadays, you also know that the position of PKK is very, very weak inside of Turkey. You know, Turkey doesn't need foreign intelligence, for instance. You know, it has its own manned and unmanned aerial vehicles, you know, armed and unarmed. So Turkey can able to gather intelligence, information, and it can continue its struggle with very, very few losses. So it's not, it's a kind of robotic wars going on inside of Turkey. So PKK has just realized this reality. It's unable to work, to fight with these unmanned aerial vehicles, with drones. Yeah, exactly. So nowadays, the power balance between the Turkish state and the PKK is very, very asymmetric in favor of the state forces. So it's not sustainable for PKK to continue its armed forces inside of Turkey. So therefore, it tries to hit and damage Turkey from outside, and from the Iraq and from the Syrian part. When we look at the Iraqi part, we see that Turkey began to normalize its relations with the Barzani government. And, you know, his first visit, the first visit of Nichirvan Barzani, the current president of the Kurdistan Autonomous Region in northern Iraq, was in Istanbul, and he met with Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Istanbul. It was the only, Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu was the only minister who participated the ceremony, his ceremony in Erbil. So this normalization is in favor of PKK. So probably it will make the situation much more difficult for PKK to be active inside of Iraq. And now we have the Syrian part only. So one way or another, my expectation is Turkey will cooperate sooner or later with the United States. So when the United States just withdraw their support from YPG, there is nothing left in Syria, because it's not a mountainous area. It's very difficult for PKK, as we have seen in Afrin region, which was much more convenient for them. They have to withdraw their forces to some other places. So to me, yes, the Turkish state, in order to consolidate domestic political stability, it will open some room for the Kurdish actors, but not necessarily with the PKK. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank our panel. We will move on to the lunch, and then we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock, and we'll listen to the keynote address by the Honorable Mehdi Eker. He's a member of parliament and former minister in Turkey. I want to thank you all for your attention to this panel discussion. Please join me in congratulating the panelists.